Okay, so hi Dori, could you please tell me more about yourself?
Yeah, okay. Well, my name is Dori Yates. I competed in the 2016 Olympics in wrestling. Do not wrestle anymore. Dabbled in rugby a bit, but am now sort of starting jujitsu, sort of just being a retired athlete. Just finished my master's, or like in the process of finishing my master's. And what else? I'm 28 years old.
Sick, thanks. Just for like my personal interest, because I think it's cool. Can you tell me what your master's thesis is about?
So I studied civil engineering in my bachelor, and my master's was also in civil engineering, more specifically in hydraulics or hydraulic engineering and river erosion. So it was like a 2-year study where we started by researching where we could find this specific type of deposit called glacial till, and then getting undisturbed samples, bringing them back to Montreal, storing them properly, doing all sorts of geotechnical tests to find out their material properties, and then testing them in what's called a hydraulic flume, which is basically a big water slide in the McGill hydraulics lab to see at what critical shear stress these glacial tills erode and their like erosion mechanisms and things like that. So pretty neat project.
That's amazing. When you said water slide, I was like, whoa, that's fun. So you said that you're like a retired athlete, but do you still practice a bit of wrestling even though you don't really compete anymore?
No, I don't practice wrestling anymore for myself. Like I'm not training or trying to get better. I'm not competing anymore. But if people want to take privates or wrestle, I'm always ready to coach. And my brother still actively wrestles, so if he ever needs like a training partner, I'll just hop in and drill technique with him, and that sort of thing. So I'll wrestle for fun, but I'm really not serious about it anymore.
Okay. So how did you encounter martial arts and combat sports in Montreal?
How did I like get into it?
I guess so.
Um, well, so my backstory is I did gymnastics from when I was 4 years old till basically 14 for 10 years, and I wanted to go to the Olympics in gymnastics. My mom was on the national team for gymnastics from her country in Hungary, so then I was like super keen to go. Plus, she was like really hard on me and my siblings to make sure we got to the Olympics, and then I didn't get really anywhere near it. I was like maybe top in Quebec at best, but my younger brother got closer. He was one of the best in Canada in gymnastics. We all did gymnastics. But anyway, long story short, it was not going to happen for me at 14 years old because basically 14-year-olds have to be already on the international scene in gymnastics if they're going to have a chance, right? Because the top athletes are like 16. But my dad went to the Olympics 5 times in wrestling. So then I was like, all right, well, if gymnastics isn't going to work out for me, maybe wrestling might. Maybe it's in my blood. So then I switched over, tried wrestling at the Montreal Wrestling Club, which is more or less the only wrestling club that exists in Quebec. So went there when I started wrestling at 14. And then within 6 months, competed in my first Canadian championship, which was already a higher level that I'd competed in gymnastics. And at those Canadian championships, I won. So I was like, all right, well, clearly, if I'm going to make it to or reach my Olympic dream, it's going to be in wrestling, not gymnastics. But this looks like a good first step. And then I just kept wrestling until 2016. I finally made it to the Olympics in Rio de Janeiro.
Wow. And how was that?
It was pretty surreal. Like, had to consciously tell myself to stay grounded and not go off into the clouds because you dream about a sort of day like that for so long and then it finally happens, but you kind of also need to stay focused, right? So definitely worked a lot with my sports psychologist and how to deal with the fact that you made it, but now you have to like refocus, and then the whole other part of like coming back home after the Olympics and like now what was a lot of emotions.
It's amazing what you said about the Olympics, about like staying grounded and that like you made it, but then what do you do now? I went nowhere near that, but I went to Jeux Quebec and figure skating. And I remember that like I was so overwhelmed because like it's a lot of fun also to go with your team. And then I was having so much fun. And then my performance was like terrible because it's hard to like, yeah, stay grounded. And then what do you, because I feel like Olympics is like the end goal, but then like once you're there, you still have to perform. So there's still like an after, but it's hard to imagine it, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, what's good is, well, first of all, like, probably Shoots Quebec is a good example. It's multi-sport games, right?
Yeah.
It's not just your sport, which you're so used to competing with just your sport. You're used to like the ambiance of being with you, your figure skating team, me, like a wrestling competition. I know exactly what that's like. But then all of a sudden, I'm in a village with like all these different athletes of different shapes and sizes, and everyone's so focused on themselves and different countries and whatnot. But like, I had done several multi-sport games at least by the time I got to the Olympics. That especially the year before was the Pan Am Games. And they were in Toronto, and it was like a very good chance for me to like almost like warm up to what to expect the next year at the Olympics. Because the fact that it was in Toronto, obviously there was like a much higher media presence. I got to deal with like taking interviews between matches, and like my friends and family being present and more sort of involved in my wrestling than they'd ever been, which was clearly what was going to happen at the Olympics because it's the Olympics.
Oh, because there in Toronto, you were like the local star type thing.
Well, because like, I mean, think about it. Like when the Pan Am Games happen, usually nobody really knows about them. Nobody can follow. Like nobody knows. Like they just happened. For instance, 3 years ago or 2 years ago in Peru, and like you don't follow it really. But when it was in Toronto, CBC got the rights to it, and they got to like show it on TV basically.
Oh, nice.
It's rare that they show, I guess, amateur sport on TV, right? So that was like almost like a pre-Olympic warm-up. And then I actually won the Pan Am Games. So it was like also dealing with all of that. It was like actually just the perfect warm-up for the following year experience.
Amazing. Okay. And so if we talk about martial arts and combat sports, because then you said that you had your wrestling team, but there were also other sports, but do you identify as a member of like the martial arts and combat sports community of Montreal? Does that speak to you at all?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it wouldn't have up until let's say 2012 because my first 4 years wrestling, I was like solely at a wrestling club. So I was around wrestlers. My competitions were very much amateur sport. I didn't know the martial arts community unless maybe some of them showed up to practice to work on their wrestling, but I didn't associate with them. But then in 2013, I left the club that I was training at, and I started training at TriStar, which is clearly an MMA gym. And so there I was working on my wrestling, but the majority of my training partners were fighters who were, either close to me in size or there was like some benefit to me and to them to work together. I still focused on my wrestling, obviously. My goals were in wrestling. But there I actually started to meet people in the MMA community and like, witness jiu-jitsu, kickboxing, boxing. And I took a couple boxing classes, tried jiu-jitsu a little bit, but obviously still focusing on wrestling. And then now that I've officially retired from wrestling, I have played around a little bit more. Like I've boxed and I've done jiu-jitsu. So I think I know the MMA community fairly well at this point.
Do you identify with it? Like, because wrestling, it can be one thing, but it could also be like a part of the training of MMA fighters. So do you feel like you're like a part of that community?
Like yes and no, because I guess since I have like zero desires to compete anymore, or even, there was a time where I was like, oh, maybe after wrestling, I'll transition into MMA and like maybe fight in the UFC. But that was more like I was surrounded by UFC fighters. So that was like an idea. But right now my body's so broken that it's like purely recreational for me that I identify with them, I suppose, because I participate in a lot, but I'm not actively competing. So I guess I miss that sort of intensity.
Okay. Now moving on to questions around the COVID-19 pandemic. So it kind of took a toll on the community for a lot of gyms and a lot of athletes or just like leisure practitioners who couldn't really practice. So I'm going to ask you questions about like the kind of progression. So if we go back before the pandemic, you said that you weren't wrestling anymore. So you were doing rugby. So you weren't really in contact with the community or wrestling. Let's say like 2019, 20.
Well, like I'd be giving the occasional wrestling class or private. So like I was, I guess, peripherally involved. My brother was actually qualified on the Canadian team for the Tokyo Olympics, but he had not qualified Canada internationally. So he didn't have his spot at the Olympics, but he was the Canadian representative. And he was training at a TriStar, and the pandemic completely just cut off his entire journey to the Olympics because he wasn't even able to, he had nowhere to train, he had no one to train with. All he was able to do was sort of like cardio and weightlifting type stuff. And then all of a sudden, May 2021 comes around, which is the last Olympic qualifier for him in like, I don't even know where it was, like Kazakhstan or somewhere. You go to try to qualify your country. It's the last chance to get a spot at the Olympics. And he didn't even bother trying to go. He's like, I haven't wrestled in over a year. Like, what am I going to do? Go and try to qualify after, not wrestling for a year. So I've like witnessed the effect it has had on like my brother, obviously. And I also had friends who competed at the last Olympics who clearly did not have the same preparation as, for instance, European countries had, or even honestly, like the United States. They must have had a different priorities. They had different priorities, let's say, maybe, because obviously wrestling is a contact sport. Yet they were able to keep training, whereas in Montreal, for one, but also just all across Canada, all wrestling clubs were forced to close and athletes were not the priority. So nobody was able to really properly prepare. I know some of them went to parks to try to drill, and like they just tried anything because some of them were already qualified for the Olympics. But how do you prepare for like the biggest sporting event in the world without the ability to train? It's not like gymnastics or some of these sports where you could actually keep going. It's a contact sport, and you can't just keep a small bubble. Like, you need to train with several people, different styles, to properly prepare. So like, yeah, it didn't affect me personally because I was not wrestling anymore. I mean, I guess it affected the privates I was giving. I could no longer give privates, but it affected the people close to me or the people who were trying to prepare.
Yeah, and I guess that was hard to watch for you too. If it was like your brother, it's pretty close, and probably had a lot of like hopes for him, and to want to see him succeed. So it's
well, he's still young, so like it's not sort of like, oh, it's
okay,
time's up or whatever. He had a training partner though who it was very clearly his last chance at an Olympics. So he actually went to that qualifying tournament
in Kazakhstan.
I mean, I'm making that up. I can't remember what country it was in. It was somewhere in like, I don't know, Europe or.
Yeah, but he had to like fly out to qualify to maybe.
Yeah, wow. And also they both compete in Greco-Roman wrestling, which is it's not really funded by Sport Canada because they haven't had results in that sport in a while, and that's kind of how funding works. So the other thing too for my brother was if he wanted to go to this qualifying tournament, it wasn't just showing up and hoping for the best. Like, you had to pay for it. It's like $5,000-$6,000 to do this kind of trip because you have to pay for your coach to go. You have to pay for you have to stay a certain amount of days, a hotel, all the stuff that goes with it. So it's really expensive. So if you're going to go, you kind of have to check whether or not you have a chance of doing well. So like for my brother, it was like, okay, look, he's 22. He's like, okay, I'll just, just cut my losses, train really hard for the next one. It's only in 3 years. So I guess the cycle's shorter. But for this other guy, his training partner, he's married. He has kids now. Like, he needs to sort of move on. This was his last chance. And he just spent the last year not being able to train like at all. But he still, spent the money to go and give it his chance. It's like, I mean, at a certain point, you got to be like, all or nothing. It's his last chance, right? So like, he obviously didn't qualify in the end, but it was just tricky because you want to see people at least have a chance to live their dreams, and my brother like didn't even really have a chance. And some of my friends who live in Calgary who actually were at the Tokyo Olympics, they had qualified right like literally the weekend before the pandemic hit, so they actually knew that they were going to be competing at the Olympics. But then they didn't have the means to prepare properly. So there's like two sides. Like, either you couldn't even make it because you weren't able to train, or after qualifying, you couldn't perform very well because you couldn't prepare at all.
Yeah, it's crazy because I was going to say, oh, well, yeah, there was COVID. It was harder to train. But I mean, like, there was COVID everywhere in the world. So it was harder to train for all the athletes. But no, because some of them were prioritized. Like, I was in France during the pandemic and I was training like Muay Thai kickboxing. and then the gyms closed, but the pros, they were training like more than ever because they
Yeah,
had the gyms to themselves and they were really like a priority. So, I mean, for them, they just got better. Like I know a girl, it was easier for her to make the transition to MMA because of COVID, because like there's a
yeah.
lot of opportunity and like the government have special regulations. So it's kind of frustrating to see that it's not like it didn't hit everyone the same. And it depends on also like,
Yeah, but it's tricky to even say who's right. Like it literally just comes down to priorities because it's like right now, I think as long as you're at least consistent and like not a hypocrite, it's the best you could do. Because for instance, if you were to look at the Canadians in wrestling's performance at the last Olympics and you were to judge them for, let's say, how they performed, which was nowhere near their level, nobody was able to prepare. Like, how could you perform at your level when you have no way of preparing? If you're to judge them, you're in the wrong because the Canadian government made a choice, and honestly, it probably was the best choice, right? Like every life that was lost because of COVID was a life too many. So it's like you can't say that preparing for the Olympics is necessarily more important, but clearly other countries did think that, which is how it created this complete inequality at the last Olympic Games because I mean, maybe they handled it better. I don't know what the situation was in the States, for instance, but they clearly were able to keep training. The American team had one of the best performances ever at the last Olympics, and they have a very strong wrestling room. It's centralized, so everybody's there. Maybe they just kept their bubble. Maybe all the Olympic athletes were there and they didn't see their family, and maybe they were able to keep the community safe like that. Also, we all know that USA did not perform very well in this pandemic in general, highest death rate out of any country. So it's like, I don't know, it really comes down to just how different countries prioritize. And it's unfortunate for, I guess, athletes who had a dream, but at the same time, if you ask an athlete, would you rather, I don't know, this person died or you got to prepare? Like they would for sure choose to keep the person alive. So it just comes down to a country's priority. And like even in rugby, a lot of the Quebec girls who are very high level, and like the World Cup in rugby is actually coming up, they all went to France for this past year and competed in the French rugby leagues as a way of, keeping up with their sport and training during the pandemic. Because I guess schools, all classes were online anyway. So a lot of them were able to kind of keep going like that. It's interesting, I guess, at the end of the day. Like I can't judge and I can't pick a side because it's truly difficult. But I mean, it's to be expected that Canadians chose life over sport.
yeah, it's you're right. When I said what I said, then I didn't realize like France was also kind of all over the place with COVID. And but I know that like at the gyms there weren't really eclosions. So because I have, well, I don't know if you want to, yeah, no, I won't get into COVID, but it's also healthy to go to the gym, in a time like this.
Yeah, but it's also the place where you could like spread them out. It's I think in the end it's nobody knows the answer. So then you're just better safe than sorry at the end of the day. I think is the issue. And maybe they should have, I don't know, we could have talked about this forever, right? What they could
Yeah,
have
no, that's it. I'm like,
like go outside and I guess train, because it's true that in a confined space, there's a lot of germs, and gyms, especially MMA gyms, where you're literally in contact with someone, the high chance of spreading COVID. So, you just kind of make a choice, I guess, based on the knowledge you have.
that's it. Because I don't really know wrestling, but I mean, like, I guess throughout the pandemic, you couldn't practice rugby. Were you able to? Because I can imagine that, like, doing sports for you, especially if you were like an Olympic athlete, was very beneficial just for your all over balance as a human being.
Yeah, well, rugby is also a contact sport. So for the most part, like all leagues, there was no games. Like not a single rugby game took place because like you can't play rugby without tackling each other. There was like one point last summer where numbers were kind of low for COVID, and it didn't open up fully to contact or anything like that. But at practice, we were able to do like passing drills, or like, we'd wash the ball and then pass, like just do whatever you can to just get out there. I think I went to one practice. It wasn't super worth it. Not to mention, I think immediately after that practice was a COVID scare, and we all had to get isolated. And I was like, okay, honestly, like, forget about it. But I did a lot of outdoor sports, and I actually prefer. I think, I mean, but also I guess I'm coming from like a bit of a bias because like one of my main criteria after I finished wrestling was being able to do more outdoor sports because,
Okay.
there'd be like really beautiful summer days and I'd be stuck in the room wrestling and it's like so hot, so humid. And I'm like, I just want to be outside. So that's partly why I chose rugby because I got to play outside. But then, during the pandemic, I ran a lot. I have a lake, so I'm kind of lucky, I guess. I could swim a lot, bike a lot. So I did a lot of outdoor sports. So I don't feel like necessarily my physical health struggled at all because of it. I just sort of found an alternative. But I guess for people who work or only have like, I don't know, 30 minutes in a day and they want to just get to the gym, obviously that makes it tricky because like my boyfriend likes to lift weights, for instance, and he's on like a pretty strict weightlifting. He ended up literally renting equipment and putting it into his tiny apartment. His entire apartment turned into a mini gym. But that's how seriously he took it, right? It kind of again comes down to what your priorities are. Like, I'd say it was more probably tricky for the gyms than it was for necessarily the people wanting to go to the gyms because there are other alternatives. You could always find an alternative if you care enough. But for gyms, where their whole livelihood is, people paying, and not everybody's willing to do that, selfless act of paying your membership, even though you don't go there anymore. Not everybody could afford that, right? So it's like, yeah, okay, you're helping to keep your gym alive for another year while they're making it through the pandemic. But if you're not going to the gym, it's hard to justify, oh, I'll give $300 here instead of feeding my family. Like, you can't, right? But then how is a gym going to stay afloat? So, it was not easy for gyms, like both, weightlifting gyms and MMA gyms, especially MMA gyms, because it's like, how could you possibly convince a government that these people will not be in a contact sport?
Yeah, so it's great that you were able to get outdoors, but did you feel like you missed the contact or like being in contact with nature was enough?
Well, again, I guess I feel like I'm coming from a very spoiled place. I have like siblings who all wrestle, and my boyfriend is like a grappler. So like at my cottage, we have like a little mini wrestling room, and we would just kind of keep grappling. So
you did grapple,
but within my family bubble. So it was not like at a gym. But I also, to be clear, like I don't even grapple anymore. So when I say this, it was like,
I feel like you say like I don't grapple, but then like you do it once in a while and you just like
but you know what it is
put everyone to the floor and you're like, oh, but that's like nothing, guys.
But it's not like there's like an organized like, okay, everybody in the family meet at the wrestling room in 10 minutes. It's like sometimes we're just in the kitchen and somebody attacks you and you just have to kind of figure it out.
And so you go to the grappling room. It's like, okay, let's take this outside, guys.
Yeah, let's take this outside to the grappling room.
That's amazing. Oh my god.
No, but like I don't want to give the wrong impression here. It's not like I lost my ability to go to a grappling gym and I all of a sudden had an alternative. I wasn't really.
Record again? I think we were saying that you were getting attacked by a family member and then taking it outside to the wrestling room, and then you were like, I don't wrestle, but for sure you were like dominating your brothers.
No, I think I'm not the greatest example of somebody who, was affected by the pandemic is sort of a long story short, because I don't have any goals and it's not like, oh, all of a sudden my dreams are on hold or I had some progression. I was like, it was really, I'd coach, which is clearly like, if people need my help. And it wasn't like I was necessarily following anybody where all of a sudden our progression halted because of the pandemic. I witnessed my brother suffer a lot because of the pandemic, where he clearly needed to train and needed training partners, didn't have access to a training room. Day to day, I don't feel the need to go and grapple, right? Like I said, I don't have any point, I don't need to. So yeah, like I had, I guess, an option to, if I wanted to. At my cottage, there are mats, and like I am in a family of grapplers. So it's like the option was there, I just didn't need it. So if I ever went, it was because my brother needed a training partner, or I don't know, my boyfriend wanted to do some YouTube video on jujitsu in the garage. Like it wasn't, it's not like you say where it's like, oh, I need to go to a gym and I can't go. Like for me, my physical health came out of like going for runs, going for bike rides, going for walks, like whatever I could do to stay active, but it didn't have to be grappling. And then my whole point was just that I think obviously, if you have goals in fighting or grappling or any martial art, yes, the pandemics would have certainly affected you, because it's a contact sport. You need not one, but several partners, and you need a place to go to train. You can't really just keep fighting in parks, right? However, if you are recreational like I am, you could find other ways to stay healthy, I guess, until the option of doing the fun activity of grappling could present itself again. And my main point was, I think the gyms probably suffered more than the athletes, not counting the pro athletes who had actual goals.
Okay. You said that, just like to go back to what you said about like funding and how it worked, depending on the placements at international competitions, and that, let's say in the States it was like centralized or whatever, but in Canada there's not a lot, or there's only like one wrestling gym.
No, well, it depends on the sport.
Okay, so here it's not really known wrestling.
It's not, well, I mean,
like
it's
popular.
It's nowhere near as big as in the States, but for different reasons. In the States, they have NCAA wrestling. So, in college, there's a whole league. So people are obviously motivated to go into wrestling. And then the top from NCAA often go on to join the national team. And, they have a pretty big pool to choose from, like a big talent pool. Not a lot of schools in Canada have wrestling.
Would you like to see it happen, like that it's more popular here, that you could do it at university?
It's pretty unique in Quebec, because in Quebec, no high schools are really some high schools have it, but not at a very high level. And there's only one university, only Concordia has a wrestling team, and that's not even necessarily affiliated with it's the Montreal Wrestling Club that just happens to have a branch through Concordia. So it's like, whereas in Ontario, there's a legitimate competitive field. There's Brock, there's McMaster, I don't even know them all, Guelph. Several universities have legitimate wrestling teams that compete against each other. And that's how you build high-level competition, is by having those options of competition. But, in Quebec, you don't have anyone to compete against. Like, being Quebec champion doesn't mean anything because there's no one else. But even in general, there's a lot more funding for sport in the States. So naturally, they'll have more resources and more money available for their athletes, which generally leads to better performances. Judo, diving, certain sports are centralized in Canada. It's not unique to the States to have a centralized program. It's more unique to certain sports. Wrestling is not centralized in Canada. So, there's a center in Montreal, there's a center in BC, there's a center in Ontario, a center in Calgary. So, the national team is spread out across the country.
Do you think it would benefit the wrestling community if it was centralized, so that like all the best athletes from the country would be able to train together and kind of level up?
So I think that's a big thing for the States, like especially looking at these past Olympics, the girls performed so well. And I think it's because, every day you go to a wrestling room that's full of girls who are literally top in the world. But then, that comes with sacrifices. If you're going to be on the national team and you know that you have to move to, I guess, let's say I'd have to move to Calgary, for instance. I'd be leaving behind my family. I'd be leaving behind, like, if I wanted to go to McGill, I can't go to McGill. I have to go to Calgary or put my education on hold, so there are pros and cons to it. I know a few girls that did judo, and the judo team is actually centralized in Montreal. And one of my friends tried it for a year or two. It really wasn't working for her. She didn't like living in Montreal. She chose to go back home, and it literally put her spot on the national team in jeopardy. Like, you can't be on the national team if you're not willing to train centralized programs. So that kind of situation causes conflict too. But I guess if you get to a situation like, I think in the States, it's probably pretty established that, like, Colorado Springs is the national training center, not just for wrestling, but several sports. And then, like, young athletes dream of moving to Colorado to train in the national center where they have the best resources, the best of the best. And that's where you go. And, like, a lot of people come to terms with it because it's like, they know. I think it's a lot trickier in the, like, development, like becoming centralized, like convincing people like, oh, you could no longer live at home. You have to do this. And then if you think about it too, imagine if you're not on the national team. So you don't actually have the funding yet. But to get there, you move to, say, the centralized program, then you have to pay for your room, your food and stuff. And then, like, you don't really have the money because you're not actually paid to be an athlete yet, but you have to be there to have a spot on the team. Like it's not as easy as saying like, oh, that's where all the best people are. Let's all train together and get to the best. Like that's clearly the best choice, except for when you live in a country as big as Canada. There's a lot of other things that come into the equation.
Well, the way you talk about it, like the national centralized program in Colorado Springs or whatever, it almost seems at the level of like Harvard, but like instead of like a formal education, it's for sports. So it's like people kind of dream of going there, like they know about it, and it's like an established campus. Like it's probably a nice place with like a lot of amenities and like everything you need. So
for sure.
It's true that like because there is that in the States, like most people leave their homes to go to college, so it's not like that big of a step. But I feel like, let's say you and I both grew up in Montreal. Why would we like get out of Montreal to go to college or to do anything? You know, there's already everything. So it's like,
well, I think it's also
maybe a bigger
it is a bit of a. I think a lot of it comes like for me, for instance, I lived with my parents for a big chunk of my wrestling career. So like, it made it very affordable for me, right? Like. Yeah. If I were to leave, every penny I would have made wrestling, which wasn't even that much. Like Canada does not pay anywhere near as much as the States does for sport.
Is there professional wrestling here?
No, well, professional wrestling is WWE, which is like not the same at all, right? So it's like
it's like the show entertainment thing. Okay, so it's only amateur for like actually competitive.
Yeah, and so then like based on like the amount of money I was making from my carding as a wrestler, it would have been enough to cover, let's say, like rent and sort of food, and then I would have had no money saved, nothing to get me going for like the next part. So like if I would have had to live in Calgary, let's say, and all of my money went towards my living expenses, like it probably could have benefited me in terms of maybe performing better, but at the same time my performance was still pretty good. You know, like I was winning a lot of tournaments, I was top 5 in the world, like I was doing fine in Montreal. So it's hard to sometimes justify those sort of, especially knowing like I'm going to be broke, but I'll be training with the best. Like even in the States, I know a lot of girls who I used to wrestle with that like before they made the national team, they'd moved to Colorado because they knew that that's where the best were. But then they were just poor athletes, all their money going to like paying rent and eating so that they could train there.
But they're not funded? You can't get like a sort of scholarship or whatever to go? Like a bursary or like?
Sometimes. It kind of depends on your situation. Like for the most part though, you get funding and you do okay once you're on a national team. But if you're not on a national team, you don't generally make any money, right? Like the sponsors don't really care about you if you're not representing your country. You're like, where is the publicity in it for them?
But it's like to get on the national team, you need to go there. So it's like intense like gamble. Yeah, it's a good.
But it is a greater trade-off in the States because like I even read an article like the Olympic champions there made $250,000 or more. Like they made a lot of money. In Canada, if you win an Olympic gold, I think you get like maybe $10,000.
Wow.
And that's like $250,000 US, right? So it's like it's just two different worlds of how much money athletes could make in different countries. So the trade-off, sometimes you could actually be like, okay, it's worth it if I could make it. In Canada, it's like, okay, I actually made it. And I'm still very much not making a lot of money, right? Yeah. So then how could I justify moving somewhere away from my family, away from everything I know and love, making no money, saving no money? It's not as easy to make those choices, I find.
Okay. Well, thanks. That was really interesting. I really didn't know about those big decisions you have to make like that for the sport.
But that's why it's like sport. It depends on the sport, depends on your country. So wrestling is centralized in the US. Wrestling is not centralized in Canada, but judo, diving, swimming, other ones are. So
yeah. So talk about different types of sports. Some martial arts and combat sports here in Montreal and Quebec specifically are not officially legalized for amateur competitions. So these are sports like kickboxing, Muay Thai, jiu-jitsu, MMA. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think it's right. Obviously, just making a sport illegal, that's clearly not, it's not made to be dangerous. There are rules in place to keep it secure. I had heard, I don't know if this is a rumor or not, but I had heard that like the whole reason it became illegal was not even because of whether or not it was safe. It was due to like the petty behavior of two organizers that were in conflict with each other. and they just kept calling the police on each other. So then over time, they just decided, let's just make it illegal, which is only punishing the athletes. So like the whole thing is just absurd. But I if it truly was true, if that rumor is true, and there's just two organizers that are super petty, like get them out. Like they don't need to be there, and there's a lot more benefit to sport than there is danger associated with it. Like all of these sports have.
Is your boyfriend?
Yeah.
His boyfriend, you call me.
Okay. Sorry. What was I saying?
There's a lot more benefits to these sports than there is danger.
Yeah. So I don't think it's right that they're made illegal. They should just find a way to make it accessible. There are rules already in place that make it safe. They aren't inherently. It's not like people are, Fight Club. It's not Fight Club. There's rules and there's skill to it, and I think sport helps a lot of kids develop different skills and mental toughness and those types of things. So I don't think it makes any sense to have them be illegal. Just have to change who the organizers are, and maybe even just create like a regulating body, make it safer and regulated. I don't think making it illegal makes any sense. It's just an easy way out, or just like an easy way of dealing with the problem because they don't feel like dealing with it. Which is common, to be honest, in Quebec. Like even with the whole pit bull debate, they're like, let's just ban dogs because we don't feel like dealing with it, instead of, looking at what the underlying causes and consequences are. Luckily, in the end, it didn't happen, but I'm just giving an example of how you saw in Montreal with Mayor Codin a few years ago. He's like, oh yeah, like we have a bit of an issue. I don't really feel like putting the time and energy into dealing with it, so let's just cut it off. And luckily that backfired, didn't work out for him. He didn't get reelected.
Weren't they gonna like kill pit bulls?
They were just trying to ban them, and then there was like a grandfather clause where it was like, if you have one, you could keep it, but like any new ones will get euthanized, and you have to keep them on, like they always have to be muzzled. It was insane. It was actually just so stupid, but it was basically him trying to look good for a small demographic that don't like dogs and don't care for it. Anyway, that's a whole other topic that I'm very passionate about, but it just shows that Montreal and Quebec have a history of just being like, oh look, a problem, I don't feel like dealing with it, let's just take some easy way out. And I think that's what sucks about politics.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Dori. Is there anything you want to address?
No, I think I talked about a lot of things here.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you.